Hello, so welcome to this first part of a two-part commentary on structuring a argumentative essay built out of the compare and contrast method of analysis. So in each of the two parts of this commentary, we will focus on a different format for structuring your essays, such as you will be writing for paper number 3 and the final. So for this first part, we are going to look at the subject by subject form. So with this type of structure, you'd begin by saying everything you have to say about the first subject you are discussing. In the case of your paper, that means the text. Then move on and make all the points you want to make about the second subject, the second text. And after that, the third, and so on, if you're comparing and contrasting more than two things, which you will be doing not for this paper, not for the papers in this class, but when you go on to 1012, you are effectively writing a compare and contrast paper, multiple items to a certain degree. If the paper is short, you might be able to fit all of your points about each item into a single paragraph, but it's more likely that you'd have several paragraphs per item. You might even have a whole paragraph per item, so you can have, let's say you have 3 items for each text that you want to discuss, then you might have like 6 different body paragraphs, 6 maybe shorter paragraphs as possible. That might be pushing it a little bit for the type of paper that you're doing, but it is possible to have, a whole paragraph per item, depending on the complexity of the item, of course. But if they're very simple items, you might have them all in a single paragraph, in which case you might have just like 4 paragraphs for the whole paper, but possibly 5, where you do, 3 body paragraphs. So in terms of dealing with text, you'd have the first body paragraph dealing with the first text and all the points therein, the second paragraph dealing with the second text and all the points therein, and then a third paragraph tying everything together. So for example, let's say that you were writing a paper about the symbolism of fruit motifs in a book called Paradise. This book doesn't exist, except in my mind. This is something I made up, a theoretical story for the purposes of illustration. But let's say that you're writing a paper about this imaginary book, and that this book takes place on an apple orchard in Maine. And it's about a girl named Eva who dreams of Florida as a paradise to which she may one day escape from her oppressively religious family. Let's say that you wanted to make an argument about the parallels in the story between apples and oranges. If you've ever heard the phrase, it's like comparing apples to oranges, meaning that, it's comparing two things that are so unlike they can't be, no similarities can be drawn between the two. That's really what that phrase means. It's kind of a ridiculous phrase, and we'll be doing an exercise based on that same phrase this week. Okay, but I digress. Let's say that you have a thesis about how apples, because of their associations with the fall of man and the exile from Eden in the Bible, symbolize disgrace and loss, while oranges represent hope and liberation, which by association makes the dream of Florida into an euphemistic vision of unattainable paradise. So in the case of this imaginary story, you'd be discussing the symbolism of the fruit in this story, right? So it's much more than a literal comparison of the two fruits. You'd be looking at the literary symbolic value of the two fruits. So you devote a whole section of the paper to, you'd have your thesis, and then you get into your body, and you have a section of the paper talking about apples first. You talk about apples in their entirety. You talk about the association in the book of apples with the fruit of knowledge in Genesis, if you know your Bible stories. Recounting of the story of Adam and Eve by Eva's father. So I'm imagining that this is taking place in the book, and you'd be connecting the apple to that story. Eva's father, the confines of the apple orchard. So this might be a second paragraph. So this might be the first kind of half of the body. And you might have 3 different paragraphs here dealing with points A, B, and C, right? And then you might talk about a particular occurrence of the apple in the story. You might draw out a passage that talks about apples, and somehow or somehow makes an association, associates the apple with something in the story. This might be a case where you summarize a small passage and quote it and paraphrase it in some degree, and then analyze that passage. So this could be, this would be a fairly complex analysis. So like I said, you'd have probably at least one paragraph for points A, B, and C. If you were dealing with simpler points and a simpler context, then you might have just one paragraph, all of apples. But I think in this case, in the case of this particular example, you'd probably want to have at least 3 paragraphs. And then you go into talking about oranges in the book, in the story, and look at patterns of occurrence of oranges. You look at the association of oranges with Florida, right? So in this story, I'm imagining that Eva, this character Eva, is dreaming about going to Florida, and when she eats oranges, she's, it triggers memory, it triggers thoughts of Florida, it triggers dreams of Florida. And then you might look at parallels of apples and oranges in the story and how that makes Florida a symbol of unattainable paradise. So this would be probably 3 more paragraphs, right, roughly. And then with point C, you might be drawing it all together. So you might have 2 paragraphs focusing strictly on oranges, and then finally a 5th body paragraph would be point C under oranges here, where you'd be looking at apples and oranges juxtaposition with one another and making that contrast and how they represent something in this character's psychological being, right? Again, not looking at these fruits in a literal way, but looking at them in a symbolic way and comparing them within this story. And at this point, you'd be drawing towards a conclusion. Once you've brought it all together, looking at the parallels between apples and oranges and the contrasts and all that, and making a definitive claim about the purpose of oranges in the story, the symbolism of oranges. And you'd be explaining the symbolism of oranges essentially by contrasting them with the symbolism of apples and how they both represent 2 different places, right? And when you explain one subject through another subject, or use one subject, item, or text to better understand another item, when you use one text to better understand another text, or to explain something in another text, you can call that a lens comparison. And this might refer to something that you might do with, say, Susan Sontag in Cornel West, if you were writing about those essays, or if you were writing about Pinsker and Orwell, or Teju Cole and James Baldwin. It would be a little bit different for each one, but with Pinsker and Orwell, say, right, Pinsker is directly commenting on Orwell's text, so you might be using Pinsker as a bridge, as a lens to highlight some aspects of Orwell's text, and then better explain something in Orwell's text that isn't maybe self-evident just by looking at Orwell's text alone. And when you do this kind of comparison, when you do a lens comparison, that's the type of thing that generally lends itself better to this subject by subject kind of structure. But there are great dangers with the subject by subject structure. And the dangers are this kind of organization is that your paper might simply be a list of points, a certain number of points about one subject, then a certain number of points about another. Right? That's usually not what college instructors are looking for in a paper. Generally, what they want is for you to compare or contrast more things very directly, rather than just listing the traits that things have and leaving it up to the reader to reflect on how those traits are similar or different and why those similarities or differences matter, right? So this is kind of in line with what I was talking about the other day in class, and that there's really kind of 3 components, right? And this type of compare and contrast argumentative essay. There's the 2 texts, and then there's the conversation they're taking part in, right? So the danger of the subject by subject organization is that the author of the problematic essay might not be putting the 2 subjects into conversation with one another, and without that conversation that joins them, or by forming a conversation out of the juxtaposition of the 2 texts or the 2 subjects, whatever they might be, without that, there's not much value to the paper. It's just kind of a list, right? The whole point of comparing and contrasting two things is to somehow analyze them and to draw some kind of conclusion, to form an argument, a stance about the two things, to explain not only the two texts more insightfully, but also to shed some kind of insight on the conversation that the two texts are participating in, whether you are forcing them into this conversation or whether they are taking part knowingly in the same conversation. So if you use subject by subject, you probably want to have a very strong analytical thesis and at least one body paragraph that ties all of your different points together, just as this one does with the apples and oranges, right? This would lend itself well to a subject by subject approach because it's kind of deeply analytical, it's very complex. And then in this kind of part C down here, 3C under oranges, it ends up tying everything together and making some kind of conclusion. All right, so that ends part 1 of this commentary on structuring your compare and contrast essays. And stay tuned for part 2 in another video.